I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, but before I do that, I feel like there's an explanation in order, maybe. I've been talking this week, as I've been uploading these movie reviews, about the Universal horror franchise, and I mentioned a few times in my review of, specifically my review of Frankenstein, and then also in my review of James Whale's The Invisible Man, that The Bride of Frankenstein, in my opinion, is the best of all of the Universal horror films, and I haven't done a review of that one. And I'm probably going to review it at some point because I really, truly admire that film and think it's a wonderful movie. But for this, these reviews are being produced leading up to Halloween. It's Halloween week 2013. And I wanted to do five. I wanted to pick five Universal horror movies to review. And I felt like if I'm going to do a series of Universal horror films, one of the films I absolutely have to talk about is Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, because it was such an important film overall through the franchise, and such an influential film well beyond the Universal horror franchise in ways that maybe people didn't realize at the time, and a lot of people maybe don't even realize today. So as good as Bride of Frankenstein is, I left it out so I could talk about some other films like Dracula, like the original Frankenstein, and films like The Invisible Man and The Wolfman that are just beloved personal favorites of mine. So I'll get around to Bride of Frankenstein at some point. But for right now, let's talk about Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. In my review of The Wolfman previous to this in this series, I talked about how The Wolfman was sort of the capstone of the first phase of the Universal horror franchise. It was the last of the Universal monsters to get its own film. The Wolfman came along after Dracula, after Frankenstein, after The Invisible Man, after The Mummy, which I haven't mentioned very much and haven't reviewed any of the films of, but The Mummy is also a really terrific film and series of films in its own right, and well worth checking out if you haven't seen any of the original Universal Mummy films, especially the first one starring Karloff as the Mummy. It's just really, really good. But so from that phase, where each film sort of focused on a single monster, we now move into what is known as the Monster Rally series. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was the film that started that trend, that started that phase of the Universal horror team-up, as it were. And it's a good film in its own right. It's definitely the best, I think, just as a film, of the Universal Monster Rally pictures, because it continues the story arc of the Wolfman in a very interesting, very compelling way that is still very true to the previous film, The Wolfman, and it brings back some of the characters from the Wolfman in ways that is very satisfying. It brings back Lawrence Talbot, obviously, played by Lon Chaney Jr., now credited simply as Lon Chaney. I guess his father had been dead long enough that he could just sort of inherit the mantle as Lon Chaney. He returns as Larry Talbot, and also a very welcome and perhaps not completely expected return, Mariya Ouspenskaya, who played Mileva the Gypsy in The Wolfman. And I didn't mention her in the review of The Wolfman that I did, but she was just phenomenal, and maybe gave, in terms of just pure acting, gave the best performance of that film, and returns here and does another great job. She was a really, really terrific actress. She plays Mileva the Gypsy, who sort of knows about werewolves. She was the mother of Bela, the werewolf that bit and turned Larry into a werewolf. And she returns and is sort of like his guide. Lawrence Talbot returns from the dead at the beginning of this film. He dies at the end of The Wolfman, and he is brought back to life by the beams from the full moon. And this is where we first see the connection between the werewolf transformation and the full moon. You didn't get that in The Wolfman. It wasn't part of the story. But beginning with Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, you see that it is very closely related to the full moon. When the full moon is out, that's when Larry transforms into the Wolfman. And Larry Talbot's story, his character arc in this film, just as in The Wolfman, and just as in the other great Universal horror films, is a tragic one. He remains a tragic character. He's not just there filling time. He's not just there as an attraction. The story is about this tragic life of Larry Talbot. Larry's motivation in this film, and it's one of the things that I think gives it its enduring power and lifts it above the other sort of lesser Universal horror films. Larry's motivation is that he wants to die. There's a darkness and a sort of morbidity at the center of this film, as there is at the center of The Invisible Man, even though it's a ton of fun, as there is at the center of Frankenstein. There's sort of a dark, tragic core at the center of this film, and at the center of this character, of the Wolfman, that really gives it some gravity and some emotional weight, even though overall it's not a heavy movie. It's not the sort of thing that is going to drag you down and depress you, or even scare you really profoundly. It's mostly just a fun, enjoyable movie when you view it today. But that motivation, that, you know, the Wolfman is this cursed person. He's this cursed guy, and he just wants to escape the curse. He just wants to die. And he discovers, because of his condition as a werewolf, that he can't die. And that's all he wants, is to die. The thing that brings these two characters, the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster, together is that Lawrence Talbot is told by Mileva the gypsy that there is a man in another village, Dr. Frankenstein, who has this power of life over death and may be able to help him, because Frankenstein is said to have created life from death, and perhaps Larry reasons he might be able to drain the life from Larry's supernaturally infected body and allow him to find permanent death and peace. So he travels to the village. They learn that Dr. Frankenstein is dead, and that his castle has been abandoned and the creature was destroyed. So Larry goes up to the castle and he discovers the work of Dr. Frankenstein. He discovers his notes, and he also discovers the monster. He discovers the Frankenstein monster, and there, for the first time in the Universal franchise, we have two of the monsters on screen at the same time. We have Larry Talbot, who is the Wolfman, looking at the Frankenstein monster. And this is a momentous scene in this franchise of films, because now we have a universe. And that's one of the reasons, that's really the main reason why I wanted to talk about Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, because not only is it the transitional film in the Universal series of horror films into that later phase of monster rallies, but it's one of the first films, maybe the first film, where characters in their own separate film series were established as being in the same universe. It's like when comic book readers realized, around this same time, by the way, and in the early to mid 40s, that Superman and Batman lived in the same world, that they could visit each other, that Metropolis and Gotham City were in the same world. And it's a concept that has been exploited with great success ever since. It's the first seed planted of what we see now with the Avengers, with the Marvel cinematic universe. Just as the Wolfman had so many little threads that connected it to the other Universal horror films, like Lon Chaney Jr. being the son of Lon Chaney, the Man of a Thousand Faces, who was to be the original Dracula, like the werewolf that turns Lon Chaney's character into the Wolfman being played by Bela Lugosi, the actor who eventually played Dracula after Lon Chaney died. We also have little bits of that in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. I mean, obviously, there's, in terms of the plot, this is a direct sequel both to Son of Frankenstein and the Wolfman, but also for the only time in all of the Universal horror films, Bela Lugosi appears in this film and plays the Frankenstein monster. He's in the makeup. He's got the flat top. He's got the bolts in the neck, the scars. Bela Lugosi plays the Frankenstein monster. And that's another little interesting trivia note, is that after Bela Lugosi was so successful in Dracula, he was originally considered for the Frankenstein part. Before it was given to Karloff, Bela Lugosi was selected to play the Frankenstein monster in Frankenstein, but it fell through for a variety of reasons. I'm told that the makeup test wasn't very inspiring for Lugosi. The original makeup that Lugosi would have worn would have not been like the Karloff makeup at all. It would have been much more like the character of the Golem in the silent horror film The Golem, with a big wig and a much bulkier costume. And Lugosi wasn't crazy about the part because there wasn't any dialogue, and Lugosi felt he was a star and he should have parts with more dialogue and much showier, sexier parts. But here we have Lugosi in a different phase of his career, playing the monster, the Frankenstein monster that he was originally cast to play back in 1931. And so it's an interesting callback in a way. And when the inevitable scene happens, when Larry Talbot transforms into the Wolfman and he faces off against the Frankenstein monster played by Bela Lugosi, you have this incredibly meta moment in this film where here's the Wolfman played by Lon Chaney Jr., the son of the man who was originally supposed to play Dracula, facing off against the Frankenstein monster, played by the guy who eventually did play Dracula in Todd Browning's Dracula, and who was also originally cast to play the Frankenstein monster instead of Karloff, now playing the Frankenstein monster. There's just so much going on if you have a little bit of knowledge about the history of the Universal franchise and the different paths that these actors' careers might have taken if not for this or that. It's just such a fascinating scene just to look at and behold and think, wow, there is Lon Chaney Jr. playing the Wolfman, fighting the Frankenstein monster, played by Bela Lugosi. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, even though it is not on the level of the very best of the Universal horror series, even though it is not The Invisible Man, it is not Bride of Frankenstein, it is not The Wolfman, it's still a very, very well done film in its own right. It's much better than a film of this type could have been or might have been. When you think about teaming up two characters like this, it was surely pitched as a purely commercial exercise of, well, let's just take these guys and put them in the same movie and maybe people will go to see that. There is a definite whiff of capitalism about the whole premise, but it's pulled off. It's pulled off very well. And it may not be the best of the 5 Universal horror films that I've spoken about this week in these reviews, but it's still well worth your time. And if you have not seen Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, both for its historical value as the originator of the monster rallies and as the originator of just the team-up film in general, and as just a very solid, classic, old-school horror film in its own right, starring some of the great stars of the Universal horror franchise. You should check it out. You should give Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman a chance if you have not seen it already, because I think you'll enjoy it. It is not only an historically significant monster movie, but it's a very fun, very good monster movie as well, and a great movie to watch for Halloween, even though by the time you see this, Halloween will be over. But fuck that. Every day's a good day to watch a monster movie.